Now we're going to get into more of the metabolic demands of muscle. How does it get its energy? How does it sustain that energy? There are two different types of energy production. So we're talking about ATP production here, and we're going to get into the details of how those two different types, how they look. So muscle metabolism is essentially how muscles make the ATP that they need, and we know where they need that ATP, right? The myosin heads specifically require that ATP to be bound in order to drive the cross-bridge cycling. And so we'll talk about how that ATP is made. We know it's made in the mitochondria for the most part, but it can also be made by other means, and we'll talk about that. So ATP is required to make muscles work, make that cross-bridge cycling happen. And that cross-bridge cycling we know is going to determine how much force that muscle can then produce, okay? Now there are three main sources of ATP for muscle production. There's phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate. This is the creatine phosphate system. This is a very temporary system. This is kind of just like, I want you to think about this as like a backup battery. It's really just a temporary bit of energy reserve in order to get muscle contractions started. It's not sustainable. It's not going to go on for more than any significant amount of time. And so we're really going to rely on the other two processes that we'll talk about to generate more sustainable means of ATP production. So the other two processes are oxidative phosphorylation. We know about this process. This happens in the mitochondria. This is that, electron transport mechanism that generates most of the ATP in cells overall. And then there's also glycolysis, specifically anaerobic glycolysis, which is where we can make a smaller amount of ATP, so not as efficient as a process as oxidative phosphorylation is, but this does not require oxygen. So that's the main difference between these two mechanisms. Oxidative phosphorylation is going to require oxygen. It's going to be more efficient, produce more ATP. And then anaerobic glycolysis is going to be anaerobic, so it doesn't need oxygen, but there's going to be a price to pay that I'll talk about when we get to that mechanism. So let's talk about that first transient mechanism of making ATP. This is the creatine phosphate system. This is basically that energy reserve for muscle to get the muscle contraction going very quickly. So when muscles are at rest, there's a small amount of ATP that's kind of just sitting around, and we think about it as being on tap, just kind of ready to go when that muscle, is ready to contract. And this is brought about by creatine kinase. So creatine kinase is the enzyme that's, in our muscles that can generate ATP and creatine. If we drive this reaction to the right, it can make creatine and ATP. That ATP we can use to start that muscle, contraction going. And then this reaction can also occur in the left or the reverse direction, which is where we have enough ATP on hand and the muscle has now begun to relax, and we can drive the reaction back to the left and make creatine phosphate and ADP once again. So we're pretty much just using creatine kinase to kind of pass this phosphate back and forth. So the phosphate can either be on creatine, or we can put it onto ADP and make some new ATP. And so based upon the law of mass action, which is basically determining which direction the reaction will proceed in, if we use up the amount of ATP that we've got in the cell, so if the muscle starts contracting, we're going to start driving the reaction to the right to make more of that ATP in order to keep it lingering on tap for the next muscle contraction. And if the muscle is resting and we have enough ATP made right at the end of a contraction, so to speak, we'll drive the reaction to the left so that we can make creatine with the phosphate and ADP instead, okay? So the direction of this reaction would be determined by how much ATP we have to sustain or to drive that muscle contraction. If we use up all of our ATP, we'll drive the reaction to the right so we can make more ATP and have it on tap. And if we have enough ATP, we'll drive the reaction to the left so we can keep that phosphate on creatine until the next time that we need to make more ATP. And so again, this is a temporary, very short-lived, production of ATP just to get things going while the other two sustainable mechanisms are warming up, which can keep muscle contraction going for a longer period of time.